Welcome to sunny Sandgate and the beautiful Hythe Bay behind me on a glorious Sunday morning. My name's Tony Quarrington and I'm a local tour guide for Folkestone and Sandgate. And what I want to do in this film is explore the three properties in which H.G. Wells, the great writer of the late 19th and 20th century, lived in Sandgate. H.G. Wells was born in 1866 in Bromley. When he was a young child, he had a serious rugby accident which left him with a permanently bad kidney condition. And that was exacerbated in 1898 when he was on a tandem cycling tour with his wife around the south coast. The upshot of that was he was recommended by a local doctor to move to the sea to recuperate. Wells always had this fear that he would ultimately end up in a wheelchair, and we'll come back to that later in the film. But he started to look at properties along this coast, and ultimately he plumped for Sandgate. On the 29th of September 1898, Wells and his wife rented the building behind me, which was known then as Beach Cottage. It wasn't as garish as it is today, but it was called Beach Cottage. That property is now number 2 Beach Cottages. Wells did not like it because this was long before the days of beach preservation, and the water used to literally go over the top of the house on a regular basis. And Wells complained that the fish would literally arrive on his dinner plate fresh. It seems that in those days they didn't have the same reverence about fresh seafood that we have nowadays. Wells may have been disappointed with the property that he lived in initially in Sandgate, but he became very attached to the village and he liked the coastal living, and his health was improving significantly. So he decided that this was where he wanted to live permanently. And so what he wanted to do was to have sea views while he was working. So he arranged with the local landowner, the Earl of Radnor, to lease a plot of land high up on the cliff there, where he could work and observe the motions of the sea and so on. But obviously that building of that was going to take some time. So in the meanwhile, he rented this 3-bedroom semi behind me called Arnold House, which is number 20 Castle Road. And this is where he lived for the next year or so, while he kept an eye on the builder and the architect working away on the cliff to my right there. Right, we're now on Radnor Cliff Crescent, so we're much higher up now from the seashore, and we're about 100 yards from Spade House, which became H.G. Wells' home from the end of 1900. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But behind me, I know it might be a bit blurred, but behind me you've got the lovely curve of the bay. You've got the Sandgate Castle, rebuilt in a Martello style shape, and the coast leading down to Hythe and round to Dungeness. Right, we're now at Spade House on Radnor Hill Crescent, where H.G. Wells and his wife Jane moved at the end of 1900 and were to live here for 9 years. The architect of the house was a famous Victorian architect called C.F.A. Boise, and it was built by a local builder to Folkestone called William Dunk. It cost £1,760, although the actual final cost was more than £3,000. But Wells had money by this time. He had some success with a number of his books, although he was still only in his early 30s, including First Men in the Moon, which he completed at Arnold House, which we saw earlier. So they moved here in 1900. It's said that Punch magazine said that the reason he picked this spot was he could keep an eye on Jules Verne across the channel, because they were sort of great rivals at the time for the sort of initial science fiction novel sort of genre. While it was being built, he was down in Arnold House there, and he was, before the trees grew to the height they are now, he was literally able to see how the building was going. And he would be up here every day, literally arguing with both the architect and the builder about how they're putting the building together. I mentioned right at the very beginning of this film that he was, because of his kidney condition, he was very worried that he would end up disabled and in a wheelchair. So he had the building, all the important rooms like library and study and dining room and so on, were all built on a level that enabled him to move around quickly. What we've got here outside is the rather sad remnants of the original Spade House sign. And perhaps this is an opportunity again to remind anybody who might be able to do it, like the H.G. Wells Society, that this really needs renovating, because it's a beautiful sign. There is a similar one next to the front door, which today we can't really go close to, and I'll explain why in a minute. But there's the original Spade House. Now, why is it called Spade House? Well, it was called Spade House. CFA Voisey had a slogan. All his buildings had to have head, hand and heart. The head was the original concept of the building, the vision. The hand was the craftsmanship, and the heart was it meant to have some sort of spirit, some sort of passion attached to it. And he had a tendency to put a heart somewhere on the buildings. And he wanted to do that with the letterbox at Spade House. Wells was utterly appalled by that idea, and after a lot of arguments and negotiation, they agreed that the heart would be turned upside down into a spade, and then the building would be called Spade House. So that was how the name Spade House came about. Wells had a very successful writing career while he lived here. Books such as Kipps, The History of Mr. Polly, Tono Bungay, The Sea Lady, Anna Veronica were all written while he was here. In addition to that, hundreds and hundreds of articles and short stories and so on. It also became literally a literary salon. Most of the other prominent British authors of the time lived along this same bit of coast. Joseph Conrad, Henry James, Ford Madox Ford, John Galsworthy, George Gissing, all lived within a few miles and came to Spade House on a regular basis, in modern parlance, to hang out and rap with H.G. Wells. Even Churchill and George Bernard Shaw were regular visitors as well. Wells had this reputation of being a visionary, as we know from his writing, and still to this day is regarded as the father of science fiction. The trouble was, although it was a very successful time and he had great success, he did have to leave Sandgate in 1909 in somewhat disgrace, because although he was married to his second wife Jane for 35 years, he had a number of very public affairs, mostly with young women. And in fact, it was one particular affair with a young lady called Amber Reeves, which really broke the camel's back and led to him basically being ran out of town. But by the very staid society of Folkestone and Sandgate, and also by the literary circles that he worked in. He was very much blacklisted after that. So he and his wife moved back to London in 1909, where he spent the last 37 years of his life. So what happened to Spade House after Wells had left in 1909? Initially it was owned by several private owners until 1951, when it became a vegetarian restaurant, and was so for 28 years, at a time when vegetarianism wasn't as fashionable as it is nowadays. In 1984 it became a registered nursing home with 27 patients, and that's what we have today. It was initially renamed Bay House, but is now, thankfully, in memory obviously of the great man, the name of the house is now Wells House again. I think that's it now. I hope you've enjoyed that, and enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you.